welcome everybody. We're just going to wait for a few minutes as people kind of roll in here, a minute or two. You can see we are both at the beach here. One is a little bit of a northern beach. The other is, I don't know, kind of,
It's southern.
it's southern. It's a good old southern beach.
It's because the word North Carolina is in the state doesn't make it northern.
That's exactly right. Oh my gosh, I love it. But the beaches are probably a lot prettier where that is than where this is.
Where is yours?
This is actually Maine.
Okay.
I am actually in that house right there as we speak. So in this case, it really is a little bit more realistic. I love it. All right, well, I've got 6:02. So I'm going to get us kicked off. You see we've got our beachy theme here. And so I'm going to say greetings to you from IDA Georgia Beach. I am Janet Street, an Orton Gillingham Fellow and teacher trainer with Smart Street Educational Consulting. I'm also a member of the IDA Georgia Board, and I'm going to be your host tonight. My guest is Dr. Matt Carter, who's also a board member with IDA Georgia, and he's here to get us all up to speed on the status of dyslexia screenings in the Georgia Public Schools. So Matt is a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Valdosta State University and the program director for their Scottish-Rite Literacy Program. And even more specifically, he has been directly involved with the dyslexia task forces related to this screening initiative. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a really pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad. Well, all right. Here's Matt and I talked the other day, and we decided that a good place to start. So I think most of the folks in our audience know that Georgia has passed some laws related to early intervention for dyslexia. And one of those is going to make it mandatory for schools to screen students for dyslexia. So just before we get too into this, a logistical question about that, a myriad of questions here. Like, when is this screening going to be mandatory? Who's going to get screened? How often? And who's going to administer the screenings?
All right. So a lot to bite off there. Kind of the history of this was a couple different series of legislative acts have been passed. Some of them have been in an effort to refine other legislative events. Some of them were more just kind of earmark money and other things like that kind of associated with it. But so the screenings are supposed to start this year. They're for everybody in kindergarten through third grade. And even those who are older, if we're suspecting any types of issues, and it is meant to be multiple times per year. And that's really kind of what the agreement is on. There's going to be some tweaks after 1 year of implementing it. Like I said, there was a series of legislative acts that got passed, some of them built off of, and some of them slightly adjusted other ones. So the screeners that are required this year, some of them are going to be allowed for next year, others are not. So it's just a process of kind of when they entered into it with really good hearts, hoping to bring about positive change within the state. There were different people in different rooms at different times with different kind of things. And then whenever we kind of all sat down in a room, we're like, okay, now let's do this. Then we're like, okay, wait a minute, we didn't think about it. Okay, wait a minute, we didn't think about. And that's why if you ever looked at the handbook for the dyslexia handbook, it's a lot thicker than any of the laws were. The laws are long enough, but there's a lot more information that's provided in the handbook in order to develop and kind of tease out the processes that are going to go along with these screenings.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. So what are these? So real quick, you didn't tell me who's going to administer the screenings. Is it this classroom teacher who's doing it, or is there like a specialist, or is it up to the school?
I think that one's going to be up to the school. I know one thing that we've done as part of our efforts at Valdosta State University to help out the local schools is we did it as used a lot of graduate students of speech language pathology to do this. Now that was before this upcoming year, which is where we're officially kicking off the screening season. But I don't think that there's any, and I could be wrong on this one. I have read every bit of legislation that's came out, but there's quite a bit of it. So, but I do believe that classroom teachers are probably going to, in most iterations of this, bear the brunt of it. But there's nothing as far as I'm aware of in the legislation that says that it can't be an all hands on deck type of effort. I do know that we as a university would like to help our local schools in some of that one. And in some of those situations, our help may be helpful. In other ones, it might be a little bit more intrusive to bring a large group of people in there in order to do it. So I do think that the local education agencies will have the leeway to make that determination themselves.
And is it 3 times a year that kids
It
get?
is. There was certainly talk about making it become less and perhaps looking at 2. But that's kind of where it's settled upon. There's a lot of reason for that. And mainly we're looking at the skills which we're oftentimes using to assess screening and assess the child's progress develop over time. So it's not like a kindergartner should be doing the same thing at the beginning of kindergarten that they are at the end. And we could say the same thing for even the first and second grade, and even to a degree third grade. That there's an end of grade expectations, but if we wait until the end of grade, we're kind of acknowledging with this legislation that waiting until the end to identify someone who is already struggling is probably too late. So we should probably catch them as early as we absolutely can, and then divert that path. That's something the research is really clear on, is that the earlier we're able to identify individuals, the better the outcomes are.
Exactly.
I think
And
IDA has done a great job of getting behind the early identification movement. Decoding dyslexia and other advocacy groups have really pushed for that, and it's a great thing in my opinion.
well, and it's a multifaceted thing, because it's not just that their reading is better, but and spelling and whatnot, but also just their image of themselves. They never have to
Right.
feel like they've failed if, if they're able to learn to read as at the same time as their peers are. So that's a really good point. And of course, wonderful that that's the intention of this legislation.
It's absolutely a great point. The holistic aspect of it. So sometimes reading can be the cause, and sometimes reading can be the effect. So we oftentimes have chicken or egg situations where vision may be leading to reading problems. In that situation, we identify one of them early, and then we can kind of chase the chain backwards and see if we're missing something somewhere along the way. We can think about it all the way to the realm of nutrition. There's lots of things that can have an effect on reading ability, and they're not just whether or not someone is born adept at reading, or versus someone who's struggling with great instruction. There's a number of reasons why the kind of process can break down.
I should mention too to our guests that if you type questions into the chat, either the chat or the Q&A, I'll be able to see them, and I'll try to get those addressed toward the end, because we do have some questions that have come to us upon registration. So, but you segued at one point into the skills. So that's where I want to go next. Like, what skills are being assessed in these screenings that have to do with literacy acquisition?
Right. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion really comes in. You probably could divide the skills into multiple kind of categories, but I think it's kind of easy to divide them simply into those that are predicting something future and those who are right now. For example, when we think about phonological or phonemic awareness, we can administer phonological tests in preschool and phonemic awareness tests in kindergarten, and we can predict how they're going to be reading in third, fourth, fifth grade. Once we get into second grade, third grade, we can actually screen how are they reading right now. Once we expect them to be able to do a skill, we don't have to predict whether or not they can do it. I don't have to predict whether or not I'm going to be overweight at 44 because I'm there. You probably could have done some measurements when I was 25 and predicted whether or not, and then you could have changed the path. So right now, if they're screening me for anything that would be associated with any of those things, you just tell me a step on a scale and then you say, all right, here's what we need to do about it. When I was 25, you probably wanted to take a family history. You wanted me to yes, get weight, get BMI, and the other measures which you would think that would be predictive of future health. So we have skills like phonemic awareness, which I already mentioned, the ability to segment a speech word into individual sounds. We have rapid automatized naming, which is a weird one because it serves as a both. It can predict and it also can talk about current abilities. We look at vocabulary. Vocabulary is important throughout the lifespan. So it's also kind of be on both. So a kindergartner who we don't expect to read very much right now, if they have a low vocabulary, well, then we expect that to show up some within their reading. A fourth grader who has a low vocabulary, we expect that currently to show up within their reading. Comprehension obviously is a right now thing. We can't really assess comprehension that accurately in a kindergarten kid, maybe a little bit toward the end of the school year. But even then we'd have a really broad window of what we would expect to be kind of within the typical range. And then so naming letters of alphabet. Naming letters of alphabet is really predictive at the beginning of kindergarten. It's not predictive of anything at all in fifth grade because the worst of readers can name their alphabet typically by then. Now, if there's a child who's in fifth grade and still struggling with that, then yeah, we're pretty good at saying right now, yeah, they're having trouble, but it kind of loses its predictive ability. So in those kindergarten through first grade years, we're really looking at predicting an awful lot who is likely to struggle, because that gets back into the conversation about what can we do about it. We can direct that path. We can nudge that a little bit more, usually with less intense efforts than we could if we waited until they were in third, fourth, fifth grade.
Yeah. So it's pretty easy to see, like, decoding. Can this child read a word out of context?
Right.
And encoding. Can this child spell this word out of context? But like you said, that phonological phonemic awareness and rapid naming. The rapid naming one is so interesting to me because, and now I'm speaking to you partly as a mom and not as an educator. Before I knew all of this, when I was a mom 25 years ago, I remember the psychologist saying to me that, my child had this trouble with rapid naming. And I was like, okay, like, I don't even know what that is, much less why it's important. And I feel like a lot of people feel that way. And someone said to me, and I love this, they said, every time your child is even looking at one letter, they're having to go to that filing cabinet in their brain and retrieve it. And so to be able to do that very rapidly, either one letter at a time, one letter sound correlation, or even one word at a time, they're having to do it rapidly. And even if there's just the slightest, if I'm a 10 microseconds slower than you are, that's going to accumulate over time, and I'm going to be a less fluent reader.
Right. It is really the hardest thing for a parent to understand. The rapid part is an indicator. It indicates kind of mastery over something. So a good example is if I asked you to snap your fingers, quick as you could be. If I said 1, 2, 3, snap, or if I was saying anytime you see a light, I want you to snap your fingers, you'd be really, really quick. All right. Let's say you took one semester of sign language back when you were in college. So the only information you probably have left in that brain is the alphabet and it's rusty. And I say, all right, every time that you see this light, I want you to flash up the V sign. I don't know what it is, but let's say you don't really know what it is either, but whenever that light flashes, and then you're like, oh, I have to think about it. Oh yeah, it's that. And then you do it. It's less automatic because it's slower. Therefore, that's revealing to us that it's less automatic for you. The problem with that is less automatic takes up lots of cognitive resources. If you're having to think really hard about what is that shape of the V that I need to make with my fingers and that motor movement in order to do it, then you're not able to adjust your resources and put them toward the ultimate goal of every reading activity, which is I need to understand what it is that I'm reading. If I'm seeing letters that I'm focused on trees, I'm not able to see the forest that is the entire text, the meaning that is within the text and behind the text and the multiple layers of text. And that's why that's such an important ability. But
Okay.
you are also right to be confused because it measures a lot of different things.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's what you're measuring is lots of different literacy skills, some that are more predictive than others. And so I know there are a lot of commercially available screeners for dyslexia. What is the process that Georgia has used for choosing those screeners, and have they actually chosen one or more yet?
Okay, so the process originally began with companies or individuals could submit screeners, and some that we just knew that were rather popular were just kind of glanced at. And the Deal Center, the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center, did a great job of looking at the psychometric properties of all of those. So that was me whenever I was on all those boards, and they were saying we need to have it look at this, it needs to look at this, and it needs to look at this, and I'd raise my hand every time and be like, need to look at this well, and we need to look at this well, and we need to look at this well, because we want to know whether or not it's doing an actual good job of it, not just whether or not it's there. Check yes or no. We need to understand, is it doing its job as it should? And so the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center did a psychometric analysis of, I'm not sure how many they wound up with, and they kind of ranked them as weak, moderate, or strong in regards to their properties. And I think they found 15 or 16 that were strong or moderate. So that led the state to cancel out all the weeks. We didn't need to use those. And that's kind of where we are right now. We start meeting in September to take that list of about 16, and we're going to narrow it down to 5 or less. And the rumor is that they most certainly want it to be less. One of those would be a free one. So they're not creating their own screener and then saying, you don't have to charge this one because it's ours. It's one that will be covered by funding from the state if a school would like to use that. They are going to have to use one of the screeners off of that list of 5 or less, like I said. And that's what I've been getting that question a lot of, what screener should we use first? And the answer is honestly just, I could tell you the one that I like the most or ones that are the strongest out of it. But until we have this working group, which is supposed to kind of decide by January of what that list of 5 are, I could tell you something, and then you're just going to have to switch gears a little bit next year. So,
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt you. I
no,
want to I want to clarify something. You said it's mandatory this year, and I'm assuming that's fall, winter, spring. So I might start out with a screener that ends up not being on the approved list. Is that
that's
right?
absolutely correct. Yep.
Okay.
And I mean, you would still be allowed to use that screener moving forward, but you would also need to use one. So there's the Department of Education is not going to hold it against you if you're obtaining multiple measures, but they
Gotcha.
do want you to have that one. There will be some reporting that would be involved in the things that you would be sending to the state. I don't think as of now there's a plan for it to be a clearinghouse to where we would be saying, all right, well, Lowndes County was using this screener and they got this versus Gwinnett County was using this screener and they got that. I don't think that's the point of it. I think it's more of understanding things that are going to meet the criteria that are needed for the state requirements that we have.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to start throwing at you some questions that came upon registration. And I think this is a big one for, at least for all the parents involved or on this call. How do I get my children evaluated?
Okay, so there's a couple different ways to kind of go about answering that one. And it kind of, if someone were asking me that face to face, I would certainly have a follow-up question of, how do you mean evaluated? Because through the school system will be different than the private. So I'm going to assume that this is a question that's asking about through the school system, because if you're seeking a private evaluation, then there's a number of those that are listed both on the IDA website. If anybody wanted to email me, they certainly would be able to.
And really all you have to do for that is win the lottery. And
yeah, that's the thing. So if you want to get your child evaluated for dyslexia privately, get a second job and then find someone who is capable in your area of doing it. There are a couple in South Georgia. There's our much cheaper option of free at our university, but that's not really an option for a lot of people that are living 3.5, 4 hours away. So I'll just assume this question is talking about more within the state school supported systems. And the thing is, this doesn't really lead specifically to dyslexia evaluations. That's not really one of the, if you're following the flow chart of the process, it doesn't really lead to having a specific evaluation for dyslexia. It more has the same kind of child find procedures that are there. It's just adding, we're trying to be more aggressive in finding those who are likely to struggle or who are struggling through the screening process. This also acknowledges those who are, the big problem a lot of times with dyslexia is they're doing fine in school and they don't see, the teacher doesn't necessarily see the blood, sweat, and tears that are going on behind the scenes with the parents and the tutors and the everything else that's being used in order for the child to do fine at school. This is supposed to provide an avenue for help for some of those individuals. But we identify those who are struggling, then we kind of work our way through the multi-tiered system of supports process with them to where we focus on tier 1. If we can't shore that up, we give them some small group help. If that's still showing some resistance to that one, then we can work our way on through up, at which point in time, whenever the referral comes through for the school psych to evaluate along with the rest of the team, then that's where the evaluation kind of comes in. But
it seems that it would at least give some good data to see, okay, in the fall, here's where I was measuring, in the winter, in the spring, like, am I getting it? Am I making progress? You know, maybe you're going to catch the kids who you wouldn't have caught otherwise because they're quieter, because they're getting, like you said, help at home, or
and I mean, a lot of these measures that we're considering, so the list is too broad right now to really speak to all of them, but a lot of these that we're considering do provide good norm-based standardized scores, right, which would follow the child, and you can measure growth as a result of any types of supports that you're providing for the kid. The other part about this one is, so we have the kid who's doing okay in school, but they're failing these screeners pretty routinely. I think that would help the school psychologist tremendously in knowing which leaves to turn over, or the speech language pathologist if they're part of, I mean, it kind of depends on which realms they're assessing. But if I have a child that, as a speech language pathologist, if I have a child that's referral is primary oral language and they're doing fine with their progression of learning the literacy skills, then I'm probably going to choose a couple different tests than I would if I have that reverse pattern to where they've done fine with their oral language and we're seeing deficits that are a little bit more specific to the literacy or pre-literacy based skills.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm going to go on to our next question. It is from a reading specialist. And this person says, I work with students whom I suspect may have dyslexia, but I don't feel comfortable making that determination. Any advice?
Okay, so I am one who diagnoses dyslexia regularly. That's not always a speech language pathologist thing. It's a little bit more of a niche role that I've adapted and have a lot of experience with. Saying that because I understand the need and the desire from both the diagnostician's perspective and the parental perspective to come to that firm diagnosis. It provides a lot of times some assurance, some understanding, a path to some degree. But I would also pose that I believe the most important part is being thorough in what the child is able to do and what the child is unable to do, and everything in the middle, because that really directs treatment a little bit more, or the supports which are provided. So if I have a child that someone tells me this child has dyslexia, what would you do for them? I could come up with a cookie cutter approach and probably hit most of the targets that the child needs to work on. But if I have a series of scores that are showing that they have relative weaknesses in decoding versus sight word reading looked okay, spelling looked not so great, vocabulary, once again, not so great, fluency, just okay. Like that gives me better targets. So I do think that there's worth for sure in the diagnosis of dyslexia. But I don't, I'm not sure that I would put it on the same pedestal as some. As far as this person's question goes, though, especially when we're thinking about younger kids, when we're dealing with screeners, I think the more comfortable way, and this is kind of a crutch that I used rather earlier in my career, was kind of shying away from the this child has dyslexia and instead started measuring it in terms of risk. So we have a child whose both parents struggle with reading, older brother who struggles with reading. They're in second grade and struggling with reading. And then that child, I would say, was highly at risk for dyslexia, right? Versus we have a child that has two parents who are never struggled whatsoever, older siblings never struggled whatsoever, was able to rhyme, but they're just having a little bit of trouble with a certain element that might even be based upon the classroom instruction. They're not just catching on at that child. Is that child at more risk than a child who's acing everything? Yeah, but they're probably at a lower risk in that situation. So I do think that establishing kind of levels of risk is a safer way of doing it, and it's hard to have someone argue with that as well. So I do think it's
And getting back to what you said about the diagnosis, I mean, I think one thing that's kind of beautiful about these screeners is that as a teacher, you'll be able to know, with some good data, who is really struggling. I mean, I know teachers feel like they know already, and that's often true, but it's always great to be backed up with data, and maybe they can, target their small group instruction
right.
according to what those needs are. I mean, so I do think there's a lot of value in these screeners, even if there's not a diagnosis. I think that's kind of what you were saying too.
And the older the kid gets, the more reliable that diagnosis is going to be. I'm not one of those that subscribes to can't diagnose before X age or you got to wait until this one. But if you have in a Georgia school system kid that's been screened 3 times a year since kindergarten and they're in second grade and they're not making progress in any of them, at some point in time without the full evaluation, you're probably going to sit there and say, you know what this looks like. And I'm not saying it would have to wait that long in my little hypothetical, but at that point in time, I don't know if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. I mean, it's starting to kind of seem like a duck at that point in time.
A dyslexic duck.
Yeah. So
Okay, I want to mention that we have a hard stop at 6:40, which gives us about 10 more minutes. So here's my next question for you. This is from an ESOL teacher. How do we support dually identified students? Do we advocate for MLs and ELLs, or who have characteristics of dyslexia?
right. So without getting bogged down into a long discussion on all the best practices, I kind of limit this one to what Georgia's recommending in that situation. And once we arrive at the acceptable screener, this child should be screened with that. As I mentioned earlier, extra can absolutely be obtained if there's something that someone on staff is comfortable with doing in addition to one of the measures of the state, then that would be great. Like I said, we haven't made the list of all of the measures which are going to be acceptable yet. That for all I know, there may be one that has a bilingual version of it. That would be great. I do know that there's at least 2 screeners on that list that have a bilingual measure to go along with that. That being said, we haven't met as a group yet, so I'm not sure if I don't know the psychometrics of both of them, whether or not they're both going to be approved or one's going to be approved or either version is going to be approved. We don't have a crystal ball on that part of it, but in general, the recommendation is going to be that they're going to need to be administered one of the approved screeners off of the list that is generated. And if we feel like there's more that needs to be obtained, then by all means.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Well, that is complicated, isn't it? Okay, last question that well, second to last question. This is from a literacy specialist. What about the students whose screening is well above their benchmark in the fall? Should we continue screeners 3 times a year? And do we rescreen every student every year?
All right, so that is a great question, because most skills that we think about are just going to move forward, and reading is one of those two. We don't tend to have a lot of regression, in that we're able to do something and then we're unable to do it at a later date. We don't typically have that unless there's some type of acquired thing going on. The difference is it's not a train moving along a track; the track is moving also. So yes, the train is moving forward, but if it's not moving forward as much as the track, then it's going to be seemingly kind of moving in reverse in that situation. A great example is one of the screeners, which we used an awful lot in the school system. If you showed up on day one of kindergarten and just absolutely refused to do any of the phonemic awareness tasks, it wouldn't flag you for that. Why? Because their argument, and they had a lot of good data to support it, is that a beginning kindergarten child should not be able to do phonemic awareness. This test only looked at phonemic awareness. They would have made the argument that yes, you have to do phonological awareness, but not this specific one. This specific one is something that you should be developing throughout kindergarten. Now, you take that same child who did no phonemic awareness at the beginning of it, they could have passed every other area that was assessed on that one. It looked at letter naming, it looked at decoding, it looked at rapid naming, it looked at vocabulary, and then it also looked at phonemic awareness. You could have passed every single one of those areas. But if you tried to do the same thing at the end of the school year or even in December, and you had a phonemic awareness score of that was very low, at that point in time, it would start flagging you. And that's because, like I said, they expect you to learn phonemic awareness throughout that. Some kids show up in kindergarten with these amazing vocabularies because they had parents that just really poured into them. They did lots of educational activities. The parents read to them all the time. And then lo and behold, they start school. And then the parents realize, like, okay, now school can do some of that. So we don't have time to go to the zoo every other weekend. We're not traveling, living out of the RV or whatever it may be, giving the kids all these great experiences. And then now the kids expected to gain some of that vocabulary from books. Well, they're not. Okay, so did they lose vocabulary? No, it's just they didn't maintain the pace that other people were doing. So that is a really important part about the screening, is to continuously do it. Why do we stop at third grade and not move on to fourth? Well, that gets into the argument that I was making earlier of you have prediction and you have a right now. In fourth grade, we don't really need to predict. We can usually look at their academic record and tell whether or not they're struggling versus not struggling.
Well, which is why for so long it's been typically third grade where kids get flagged.
Right.
And I think the state in kudos to the state, they're trying to move that back and let that happen earlier. Let those red flags get raised earlier.
Right. And if we can improve phonemic awareness in kindergarten, then it'll be there when they need it, first grade, second grade.
There you go.
If they don't get it in first grade, kindergarten, then you're not really talking about it much in fourth grade anymore.
Right, right. No, you're moving on to morphemic awareness. That's a whole nother story. Okay. One more question. Now this is a big one, so I don't know how much you want to talk about it, because it's probably bigger than we have. I would love this is a tutor, and she says, I would love a review of the tools available for screening.
Okay. The list right now is at 16. And we certainly don't have time, nor do I think you all would have the patience for me to go over each of them. The Sandra Dunnigan Dill Center has done a great job of producing the analysis that I mentioned of kind of the psychometric qualities of it. And like I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. They came up with this list. Is that showing up just fine, Jen?
Yes. It is.
So they came up with this list of strong, moderate, and weak. The states not allowing for the weak ones, but we have the strong and moderate ones here. Some of these are absolutely great. Some of these are challenging. Some of these are great on this scale, because this scale is solely looking at psychometrics. Some of these may be, and I'm not aware and not calling out any of them. Some of these may be the worst thing to administer from a logical perspective for any classroom teacher. I'm not sure if that's not built into this. The feasibility, cost, things like that are not built in here. So it is a daunting task right now for professionals that are trying to select these, especially with the kind of understanding that you might just be dating your screener, not marrying it.
I like.
So there's.
I'm just going to throw out one thing that jumps out at me is that in the moderate, rated moderate was the map reading fluency. And you hear a lot of people talk about how is your child's map scores? So that's interesting to me that came out as moderate.
Well, there's some that if we were to take your map reading fluency analogy and rewind to 8 years ago, and they would say, how's your child's this? And you know, they're not even on this list anymore because they would not come close to measuring the areas which the legislation is requiring. So that might be one of those situations where it is an easy test, or it is a cheaper test, or it's more easily integrated within the classroom kind of structure. But that's oftentimes kind of difficult. I will say that if anyone wanted to find this document, it is technical for sure. But if you just Google Deal Center Psychometrics or Deal Center, it's called the Literacy Screener Review. Then it's found via Google. You don't have to go digging around deep on websites. It'll bounce up if you Google it.
Okay, that's nice. And so it is public information. That's
It
great.
is, yeah. That's not privileged or posted in obscure places.
All right, this is amazing. I have 638. I don't see any questions in either the chat or the Q&A. So I'm going to assume that you've been incredibly thorough, and I think you have been. And this was really helpful from my perspective because I love hearing that our state is caring, is passing laws, is making it happen. They're giving us love. This is good. Yay. Yay for Georgia for doing this. Yay for Matt for helping. And yay for IDA too. And now everybody go to the beach and have a great rest of your summer before we all have to kick off a new school year, right?
Right. And if anybody needs to contact me at all, I answer email all the time, anytime I can. So it's MD Carter, as in Matthew David Carter, Matt Dave. MD Carter at valdosta.edu. So MD Carter at valdosta.edu. And you could probably just search me for Matt Carter at Valdosta and it'll show up, I would think. I don't know. I'm not in the habit of Googling myself.
Real quick, there was one question, and this is really, I know you're not going to be able to answer this because there is no answer. What training will teachers receive to be effective? So see, that's getting into the next layer. It's one thing to find the kids who are struggling. Is then you've got to train the teachers to address that.
I would say, yeah, I will say, without getting into the specifics, that it's sad that we're treating everything as siloed things. The screening is meant to lead into the effective education. So that's why we're looking at those individual areas so that we can provide individualized instruction for the students. But yeah, what that individual training that will be provided in order to best utilize those, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we have time for now.
I'm not going to be able to pronounce your name. I think it's Aisha. I hope I'm not messing that up, but you've just hit a chord for me because that is what I do, is train teachers. And it is, I think, so important. And I think it's very hard. It's hard work for the teachers who did not get this kind of training in their college educations. And hopefully that's also changing. I mean, I know it is due to people like Matt and people like Jennifer Lindstrom also on our board. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Matt. Now, I want you to go back to Johnny's Pier and do some fishing.
I'll try my best.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody. We appreciate you coming.
Thank you all.